The purpose of this recording is to take you through task D. So in the pre-release information, there was an email from the CFO to the FM asking, now that you've settled in, what do you know about the POPI Act, which has recently gone live? Then there's specific guidance provided by the CFO. He's asking that he is specifically interested in your inputs from a risk management perspective. As we deal with a lot of sensitive personal information, we must double check whether all the risks are adequately managed. Are you able to assist? So the expectation was for you to do research on the POPI Act, but not the general requirements of the POPI Act, but rather to focus on risk management, specifically dealing with the risk of unauthorized access to the personal information. So you had to absorb this trigger in terms of information further provided in the pre-release. So in the pre-release, an overview was provided of the software systems that Ochego School is using. So they're using a learning management system. Then you were also provided with an overview of the type of personal information being stored on this learning management system. For example, personal information of the parents, their ID numbers, bank information, vehicle registrations, medical aid details, etc. Then it was also provided to you that the schools operate a local area network. In addition to that, as part of the SWOT analysis, it was stated specifically that a threat to Ochego School is the hacking of the software system. So the expectation is to do research on the POPI Act with specific reference to the risk of access and having access to personal information. So on the day, you have been provided with the access control policy. And the CFO highlights some key points that he's concerned about. First of all, he's concerned about unauthorized access. He, however, makes the comment that there are sufficient backups being maintained. And then in the email, he also mentions that this policy covers the information security part of the suite of policies that we have in place. In addition, it is stated that this access control policy forms part of a set of policies implemented to ensure adherence to the broader POPI Act. So this is quite important for you to note that this access control policy is just one of many policies that Ochego School has implemented to ensure adherence to the POPI Act. Then the CFO mentions in the email that he wants you to undertake a thorough review of the access control policy to protect the sensitive information. So you had to focus specifically on the access controls provided on the day. So on the day, the task stated that you need to prepare a report documenting any concerns you have regarding attachment 3, which is the access control policy, including areas that have been inappropriately or inadequately dealt with or omitted. So if we look at the access control policy, I'm going to take you quickly to the policy. So just to explain to you what are some of the aspects that have been inappropriately dealt with. So first of all, when we look at the scope of this policy, the scope of the policy only addresses employees and management of Ochego schools. However, in the pre-release information, it was clear that this system, this LMS system, is used by the learners for an online learning and as an online learning platform. Therefore, the scope is inadequate, only covering employees and management. When you look at some of the additional requirements, when you look at 3.1, for example, it states that user access profiles are used to determine which users have rights of access. So there's an issue about who's got read versus write access. 3.2, it states that all changes to user access rights are approved by the line manager. So the question arises whether there's a second review. Then in 3.4, it is stated that the user is authenticated by the system. by matching the username and password to what is recorded in the system. So the question arises on whether there's additional authentication, whether there's multi-factor authentication or a one-time PIN as further authentication over and above the username and password. Then 3.5 states that users have 3 unsuccessful attempts available, and if there are unsuccessful attempts, their profile is disabled, and it could only be re-enabled once the user requests this from the IT help desk. So the question arises on whether authentication is taking place by this user to make sure it is the authorized user that's requesting the profile to be re-enabled. Then if you look at 3.7, for example, so there's training that's taking place on the confidentiality of passwords. However, training should also be extended to focus on possible hackers that wants to get access to the system. For example, the phishing attempts. So this was raised specifically as a concern, the risk of unauthorized access by hackers, and the policy is silent about that. 3.9, for example, when all access to the network is locked, however, no mention is made of a review taking place of these access locks. What is also important to note is that Archegos makes use of a local area network. So there is a need for a virtual private network and firewalls or antivirus programs to be installed to ensure that hackers do not get access to this local area network. So when you look at this task and how you should attempt the task, it is imperative for you to work with the information on the day. So just to get back to the task, you had to critically evaluate this access policy and identify any controls inadequately addressed or any omissions from this policy. So it is very important for you to engage with this policy on the day and based on what has been provided on the day to critically evaluate this policy.
Let's have a look at some of the scripts that give us an example of what a competent candidate looks like, as well as a limited competent candidate. And then we will also have a look at someone that could be highly competent. So for a competent candidate, as you can see here, we are looking at this specific script. And already we've noticed that this candidate has identified that the scope excludes the learners. We can see here that we noted that the school applies to only permanent and contract employees, but what about the learners? So already this candidate has noticed that the devices are also connected to the network, so the scope should apply to all to all learners and employees. From there, this candidate went into the different line items of the policy. So already it is evident that this candidate has applied their knowledge to the information on the day, also taking into account the pre-research that they have done. So we already see that some of these line items have identified the issues already highlighted in the policy earlier. So we can see here that for 3.2, for example, they've noticed that there should be a final approval. So that second approval by a line manager or that first approval is not enough. We can then have the second approval, in this case, the information officer. In that same line, we can see that they noticed that we should have least privilege access, meaning that some employees or some users or the learners should not have the same access rights than others. We also notice in 3.3 that deleting the entire profile is a much better control than just deactivating that username if a person has been terminated, for example. We don't want that user coming back to the system and reactivating and getting access to information they should not. We also see here that implementing that multi-factor authentication is another thing that have been identified. What's nice about the application in this is we can see that the candidate has identified that there's a control objective in 3.1. Or for instance, saying the change is correct to be approved by the user line manager. However, Or for instance, 3.4, the control objective is correct, however. So for us, this is clear indication that this candidate has applied it to the information on the day, which is then specific to the policy. We notice here in 3.5 that the user should also first identify themselves when contacting the help desk. So we see that nice authentication being implemented. 3.6, 3.7, 3.8. This candidate has identified that the control objective is correct, it is sufficient, or we should also include the learners. So in many cases, it is very evident of the application. We also see here it's not sufficient for only the logs to be generated, but a senior person should also review these logs and follow up on any unauthorized attempts. The next part, we see some of the omissions also mentioned, which is not specific to a line item in the policy, but something separate. We do, however, notice that this candidate speaks about the users not being educated by the POPI Act. So this was not relevant for the requirements of the task, but we could still see that this candidate has applied their knowledge to the policy. So there's at least good coverage of the concerns in the policy. We see then some POPI Act, the user should be made aware of the information gained, which is not really relevant to the policy. But then we see users should access the network using a secured Wi-Fi and connection. And although this is not a great concern, we can see later on that this candidate even then goes into specific detail on firewalls or antivirus software. Later on, we also notice that do not access the information using devices outside the premises, but we do need a little bit more information to realize what the concern is. But then the next moment, this candidate then also noticed that physical access is also not dealt with in the policy. So for this candidate, it is a clear, competent candidate because we can see the application to the information on the day and specifically then the access control policy, linking to some concerns that are inappropriate or incomplete maybe, and then also concerns that have been omitted completely. So yes, it is not a full list of concerns, but there's proper coverage of this policy.
Hi guys, so we're going to look at a script of a candidate that displayed limited competence. And as we go through it, we're going to note some of the things that they could have done better. So if we look at the introduction, it's very nice that they have an introduction here. They speak about the fact that, you know, it is really concerning, and they speak entirely to the POPI Act and the requirements as it relates to fines, which is great evidence of pre-research, but it was just not applicable to this particular question, unfortunately. The candidate then goes on to say, you know, I've read through the policy, we do have sound controls in place, and that they will actually prove to protect the confidentiality of the data. And then in addition, this is what they then suggest. So they say we should have firewalls in place to protect the system from hackers, which is a really good control. They identify the control and they also identify why it needs to be in place. The second control that they suggest is that they say they should make use of antiviruses to prevent virus attacks. Again, a good discussion, if I can say that, in that they identify the control as well as identify the reason behind that. Just in terms of variety, though, maybe not the greatest, because if you think about what firewalls do and what antivirus do, they kind of represent a type of control in that they all protect the network. So let's see further down if they do go on into additional types of controls that should be put in place by the schools. They then speak about SSD to ensure that only secure sites are logged onto. Not really sure what exactly this relates to or why this candidate has identified this point. The candidate also then says that the system should produce exception reports for any breaches of the above access controls. This is where we see an indication of dumping, because in the actual policy did mention that access is logged, that there are actually exception reports of this nature. The only issue was that they're not reviewed. So this candidate then needed to say that, it is great that we do have exception reports, but it is then missing this additional element of review, which they have not done. Then the candidate goes on and speaks about auto billing and payments. Information should be encrypted, pop-ups. Not really sure what the context of this is, given the fact that it is already identified in the information that the information is encrypted, and it doesn't scope in billing and payments. So this, again, evidence of dumping. The candidate then goes on to speak about one-time passwords, again, speaking to or linking it to payments, which again was not really part of the required. Then they go on to speak POPI contraventions or specific POPI contraventions, which was not required in this particular task. So all of this would have been, again, evidence of great pre-research, but just not applicable to this particular question. And this is why this candidate would have been graded limited competence. There just was not enough application of the policy, of the information on the day, and actually responding to the actual task.
So let's look at a candidate script that demonstrated a highly competent rating. So first of all, this candidate showed some insight into the risks associated with unauthorized access, and also showed some insight into the access policy. So this candidate presented the response in 3 columns. First of all, identifying what is a suggested control in the access control policy, then identifying what are the omissions or what has been inappropriately dealt with. And then the candidate goes one step further to identify why something is a concern. So why the omission is a concern, or why something is not inadequately dealt with. So what are the risks flowing from this? So first of all, when we look at the candidate's response, this candidate starts off by also identifying that the scope is an issue, so that the scope of the policy does not include employees, but linking it very well with the context and the pre-release information. So the LMS system is an online platform used by learners, and therefore the scope of this policy should also include learners. It's not sufficient to only include employees. Then what has been raised as a specific risk in the pre-release as well as on the day is the risk of hackers. So the candidate identifies that hacking is a risk, and that the policy does not address sufficiently the risk of these hackers. So with this candidate, they group together these controls as one, because as mentioned, these controls actually achieve the same objective. Then the candidate also identifies why this is an omission and what the risk is if this type of controls are not implemented. Then if you look at the second issue being raised by the candidate, is that the candidate refers to the read-write access, but brings it back to the information on the day. So it recognizes that rights should not be merely provided to the users. There should be read-write access, but also there should be the least privilege, and bring it back to the scenario, bringing in a practical example, stating that because of the type of information being maintained on the LMS system, that there's bank information stored of the parents' ID numbers, medical aid details. Not all teachers need access to all this information. So really engaging with the context of the school on the day. So when you look at the username and passwords, the candidate recognizes that there are sufficient password controls. However, the candidate then goes one step further, if you look at the response later, and state that maybe there should be innovative enhancements in bringing in these password controls or implementing password controls. So instead of just linking a username and password, maybe Otjego School should consider using biometrics. So in a technology advanced environment, that's maybe even a better way of preventing unauthorized access. The candidate also recognizes that there are training that's taking place to remind employees about the confidentiality of passwords. However, the training falls short of the fact that there could be possible phishing attacks by hackers to send out emails to employees. So the training should be extended to include also education to employees to address specifically the risk of phishing attacks. When you look at the bottom of this response, it also speaks about the revision date. So is it adequate for this policies to only be revised in January 2022? Should it not be reviewed more regularly? In addition, it also suggests that maybe there should be cybersecurity audit or IT audit to assess the adequacy of the proposed access controls. So when one considers the response by this candidate, it is evident that the candidate did not only identify omissions or inappropriate controls, but also demonstrated insight into why something is an inadequate control or why an omission could raise additional concerns about possible unauthorized access. So this additional insight demonstrated by the candidate makes this candidate a highly competent. If you review the response, it is evident that the candidate have sufficient coverage on all the aspects in the policy on the day, but over and above the good coverage, the candidate also demonstrated insight into this policy and insight into the risks that this policy, which is inadequately, can result in.